Okay, we are ready to get started. Hello, everybody. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario, at the Bet Avraham Yosef of Toronto, the Bayit. We are studying Moreh Nevuchim, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, and we are in section 2, chapter 37. The topic of our discussion today is prophecy. If you'll recall from chapter 36, the Rambam wanted to let us know how prophecy works, essentially. And he explained that it is the apex of human intellectual perfection, which is to achieve prophecy. The Rambam had told us that there are two components of the mind that at work, what he calls faculties. And this is really directly going to Aristotelian science, an understanding of how the mind works, Aristotelian psychology, as it were. There's a faculty that is much more closely connected to the body, which is called the imagination faculty. And that's where we are able to conjure images of either things that we have seen in our past or things that we connect when we have, let's say, two images and we can connect them together and create some kind of fantasy in our mind. So that's what an imagination faculty is. There's another faculty in our mind called the rational faculty, which is it seems from the language of the Rambam in the previous chapter that it's less localized to the body and is less subject to, let's say, natural inborn defect, but it does certainly require a person to be born with a certain IQ. But it's the part of our mind that's able to process abstract information that's not connected to, let's say, visual or an image in our mind. But let's say, the part of our mind that calculates mathematics and is able to understand abstract ideas. When a prophet the definition of a prophet, according to the Rambam, is someone who perfects their rational faculty to the greatest possible degree, to the point where it connects to the active intellect. And then there's some kind of emanation that comes from this external intellect that is sort of a conduit of divine knowledge, enters into the rational faculty, and then that spills over in turn into the imagination faculty that causes the prophet to have an image based upon some external divine endowment, or what Pines translates as overflow. But really the word that we're dealing with is shefa, shin pei ayin, which means some kind of emanation from God. And that's certainly the ancient and medieval way of understanding how human beings, even non-prophets, acquire information. Like when a person has a eureka moment, has an epiphany, has this a breakthrough in understanding something, many times the understanding is that this came from some external source. What I'd like to do today is we're going to cover all of the information covered in the chapter today. We're going to go a little bit out of order. So I'm going to want to share with you my screen for today so that you have an idea of where we're headed, sort of like a map. There are two lists that the Rambam creates in this chapter, chapter 37, which we've called our title, Wise Men, Prophets, and Politicians. And I think you'll see why very shortly. The Rambam starts off our chapter with a topic that he comes back to a number of times. And it's really, to me, it's probably the biggest chidush, it's the biggest novelty of this chapter, is that he says there are two kinds of intellectually perfected beings. And what do we mean by that? There's one kind of person where their intellectual perfection stops with them. They gain a certain amount of knowledge, they gain a certain amount of understanding in the world from others or from some external source, whether it's another human being who teaches them, or reading a number of books, or getting some kind of external gift from heaven through the active intellect to endow them with this knowledge, this amorphous source of knowledge that exists in the cosmos. Okay, but then they don't spill over that knowledge to others. But then there's a second category of wise people, or intellectually perfected beings, those whose perfection compels them to spill over of their knowledge and render others perfect as well. And I want you to note that the language of the Rambam is that their perfection compels them. It's not that they actively have to choose to share their knowledge with others, but they are so saturated with this level of intellectual wisdom that they have no choice but to share it with others. At some point in our chapter, later on in the chapter, the Rambam makes reference to an analogy that he had made back in chapter 11 of our section, 100 pages ago. We're now on page 373, and the Rambam makes reference to this on page 375 in the Pines edition. All the way back on page 275, in chapter 11 of section 2, the Rambam was talking about the process of emanations and how God brings about all of physical reality through a process of concentric celestial bodies, or what he called not only concentric celestial spheres, but also the intelligences, the sentience that is connected to each one of these celestial spheres. And through a process of emanation, God is being on the outside, the most exalted and transcended state, and God emanates of himself, of his essence, and of his wisdom down to the outermost sphere, the outermost intelligence. That intelligence, in turn, spills over the knowledge it has attained from God and passes it on down to the next intelligence, and so forth and so on. And in trying to describe how this process of a chain of emanations works, which is really classic Neoplatonist philosophy of trying to understand how the ultimately transcendent being can interact with a corporeal and imperfect world, the Rambam describes it as follows, and I'm using the Friedlander translation over here. He says, the nature of the influence which one part of the creation exercises upon another must be explained as follows. A thing perfect in a certain way is either perfect only in itself, without being able to communicate that perfection to another being, or it is so perfect that it is capable of imparting perfection to another being. A person, and if you recall this analogy, he compared it in this analogy to wealth. A person may possess wealth sufficient for his own wants without being able to spare anything for another. That's one possibility. You may be so wealthy that you can take care of yourself, so you're comfortable. You can afford your place in Florida and enjoy life together with your wife and be able to have what to help with your children, but you're not a big philanthropist because you don't have income on that level, right? Or he may have wealth enough to benefit also other people, or even to enrich them to such an extent as would enable them to give part of their property to others. So then you have the wealthier class. Not only do they have enough money for themselves, but they have plenty of money to be able to share with other people as well. In the same manner, the creative act of the Almighty in giving existence to pure intelligences endows the first of them with the power of giving existence to another, and so on, down to the active intellect, the lowest of the purely spiritual beings. And we've talked extensively about the active intellect. It is the lowest most sphere, and it is the lowest intelligence in this chain of concentric intelligences, starting with God and going down to our sublunary realm. And the active intellect, or the active intelligence, as it's called in other works, is the source of human knowledge, of human, perfected knowledge. When a human being perfects his own wisdom and activates his own intellect, it then plugs into this active intellect, and the active intellect spills over this divine knowledge into human beings. The active intellect does not spill over down to a lower intelligence, but it spills over into man. That's the way that Aristotle described, or the interpreters of Aristotle described this process. Now, the Rambam, in making reference to this chapter 11, in describing this purely what sounds like a mechanistic process, a process where it doesn't involve free will. It's not like these intelligences have free will. Today, I'll decide to share my knowledge with the sphere just below me, the intelligence just below me. That's not what's happening. It's that it's happening automatically and perforce Each intelligence, because it's endowed with so much divine knowledge, is compelled to spill over its process just like a machine, right? No different from anything else where the button is pushed and it just happens. In this manner, the Rambam describes the two types of wise people. Some people possess only so much wisdom that they can contain it within themselves, and others, like those higher intelligences, are compelled to spill over their knowledge and teach and educate other people. It almost takes away the sense of free will, and I want to get back to this idea as we go along. That's the first list I wanted to talk with you about today. And here comes the second list, which is the three kinds of intellectual overflow or emanation, what we call shefa, that come from God via the active intellect. And interestingly here, the Rambam lists three different categories, which is the source of our title today: wise men, prophets, and politicians. So the first is that of the wise men of science, people who are the philosophers, the scientists, who have been able to figure out the nature of all that exists around us in this world. The shefa only enters their rational faculty without overflowing to the imagination faculty, either due to a scantiness of what overflows or because of a deficiency in their imagination faculty. So a person can be very, very smart, can come up with abstract ideas, but doesn't have a great amount of imagination. And it's because of that that they stay within the realm of science and mathematics, and they're able to make a quite significant contribution to the world, but they haven't achieved the level of prophecy. Then you have the second category, which is where the shefa flows into both the rational faculty perfected by the individual and the imagination faculty, which is naturally perfect at birth. If you recall from last week's chapter, the Rambam had made that distinction. The rational faculty must be perfected, and it requires work on behalf of the individual. The imagination faculty is a result of nature. You're either born with a perfect faculty or you're not. And so you can only be a prophet if you are born with that natural predisposition to having a healthy imagination. And therefore, the shefa, this emanation, flows both into your rational faculty and then from there goes into your imagination faculty. And by being able to have that rich image of what the active intellect is imbuing within your rational faculties spilling over to your imagination, that is what the Rambam calls a prophecy. Now, of course, you and I would not depict prophecy in that way. The Rambam is saying that this is an intellectual endowment. We would normally say that a prophecy is an endowment given to God to a righteous individual. But remember this, and we're going to be continually sort of revisiting this idea. For the Rambam, prophecy comes not because of righteousness, but rather because of intellectual perfection. And then you have category number 3, which almost is amusing. He says it's that of the politicians, the lawmakers, the psychics, the seers, dreamers of genuine dreams, and wonder workers, people who are able to amaze people through either their great rhetoric, like a politician, or because they are able to do sleight of hand and conjure amazing things, or because they're truly psychics. And these are people whose shefa reaches only to the imagination faculty due to the failure of the rational faculty, either from birth or the individual's negligence to perfect that faculty. They think they are prophets, but are not. And just to quote the Pines edition, they bring great confusion into speculative matters of great import, true notions being strangely mixed up in their minds with imaginary ones. These are people who might even delude themselves of being either prophets or messianic figures, because they do genuinely have these images that flow into their minds, but because they have those images were not processed first in the rational faculty, they are jumbled sometimes and they receive images that they misinterpret. And so the Rambam is not discounting the ability for truly psychic people to be able to connect with some kind of external source of knowledge that endows them with images. But there are people who sadly, may receive images, may distort them, and then lead the masses astray. I mean, think about all of the false messiahs in Jewish history. Shabbatai Tzvi comes to mind, who lives, of course, many centuries after the Rambam. But the idea being is that what would you say about a Shabbatai Tzvi figure, about a false messianic figure, a false prophet? Well, you would say not that the person is a complete charlatan, but rather they did receive genuine images from an external source because they have a very rich imagination. They were attempting to connect to something divine, but it just didn't work because the image was mixed in and distorted because they did not carefully work on perfecting their rational faculty. And as a result, you may have had people, whether in our faith or in other faiths, that received genuine images, but ended up giving a distorted message. And that's how the Rambam would explain any kind of false prophet or psychic who, the police now rely on psychics for a lot of information and being able to identify a criminal, right? Does that mean that it's purely hocus pocus? It's purely a fraud? No, there's something genuine to it that people can intuit images into their mind that comes from an external source, and sometimes they only get a glimpse of something, and they won't be always accurate simply because they're not achieving a prophecy because they don't have a perfected rational faculty. So this is our list of 3 different kinds of people. I find it also interesting that politicians and lawmakers are included in this category, and it would seem to me, just a simple understanding of what the Rambam is trying to communicate, when a person is a leader of men, they sort of have to have some kind of image of grandeur in their own mind, and those images of grandeur lead them to try and lead the people and be able to lead them with wisdom. Sometimes these politicians are successful, and sometimes they are unsuccessful simply because the image that they receive gives them this idea that they ought to lead their fellow countrymen down a certain path. And sometimes that path is correct, and sometimes it's not correct, but it doesn't make them into prophets. I also want to point out this thing that I say over here, note, modern psychology also recognizes different learning styles. I know from raising my own children that some children are what we would call visual learners, and some children are auditory learners. And even though the Rambam's language of the different faculties of the mind sounds like an archaic system that we don't employ anymore, but we certainly acknowledge that there are different ways that different people's brains work. Some people's brains work better by being able to visualize information, and some people are better with abstract things like with math. That's why you have some kids who the only way that they can learn math properly is using, let's say, building blocks or balance scales or diagrams, and can work well with things that they have that they can feel with their fingers. There's something they even call it tactile learning, that they can, by touching, they can learn things, or by envisioning things, they can learn things. And then you have people who are able to absorb knowledge through abstraction and through words and reading or verbal communication, which has nothing to do with creating images in one's mind. So I want you to appreciate, the reason I mention that is that we should try and appreciate that although we've certainly advanced in our understanding of the human psychology, but there are many aspects of what Aristotle taught us that the Rambam is filtering for us that still hold true even to this day. We do have an imagination that creates images, and some people have a richer imagination than others. Some people have a better faculty for abstraction than others, and that's really what we're talking about here. Now we go on in the chapter, and the Rambam then points out that regarding those scientists and prophets, and this is on page 275, whose shefa flows into them with abundance, they cannot be at peace unless they are able to pass on their wisdom to others, just like the celestial intelligences are compelled to pass on their divine flow to the spheres below them. And so the Rambam really goes back to what we were mentioning at the beginning of our discussion today, which is the idea that it almost is a deprivation of free will, of bechira chofshit, if you will, that when a person is endowed with so much knowledge, whether they're a prophet or just a wise person, they are compelled to sort of spill over that knowledge to other people. Notice that the Rambam does not include the third category, those people with rich imaginations, because they're not receiving truly filtered and correct wisdom. They're just receiving a lot of images. So those people have to really decide to share that with others and to try and influence others. But the first two categories, the Rambam says there's so much rational thought that comes into their minds that they have no choice but to share it with others. And the Rambam describes this in terms of free will and bears this out from two scriptures. One is from a verse in Yirmiyahu, which is really quite explicit. It says, Ki midei adaber ezak chamas v'shodekra, ki ha'aya devar Hashem li lecherpa ulekeles kol hayom. That Yirmiyah is really lamenting the fact that he is called upon to be a prophet, because he realizes that it's an albatross, this prophecy that he has, since he is being called upon to chastise his people, to bring them prophecies of doom and suffering because they haven't followed the word of God. He recognizes that he is going to be scorned and spurned by the Jewish population, and he doesn't want to do that. The Amarti lo ezkerenu, so he says in chapter 20, verse 9, he says, I really wanted to not make mention of this prophecy. V'lo adaber od bishmo, I don't want to speak in God's name. V'haya v'libi ke'esh bo'eret, but there was something in my heart that was burning, this divine knowledge that God imparted to me. Atzur ba'atzmotai, it was sort of welled up within my very essence, within my bones. V'nil eti kalkel v'lo uchal, but I wasn't able to withhold myself. I was too weak to withhold this knowledge from others, and I could not hold it back. I had to release it, and that's certainly the way that the other Meforshim, in addition to the Rambam, understand it, such as the Radak. The prophet Amos also is cited by the Rambam to sort of reflect upon this idea that he has no choice but to share his prophecy with others. Aryeh sha'ag milo yira. He says first that when the lion roars, it's impossible not to be afraid. And by comparison, Hashem Elokim diber milo yinaveh. If God speaks, how can I not but prophesy? How can I not share this prophetic knowledge with others? Just like it's an automatic reaction to hearing a lion roar that you become frightened. So too, when God speaks to you, you have no choice but to spill over this divine knowledge to others. It is interesting that the Rambam quotes both from the prophet Jeremiah and from the prophet Amos, because we do have a midrash in Kohelet Rabbah who says on the book of Ecclesiastes, which was written by King Solomon, the midrash says, Shalosha Nevi'im, there were three prophets, Al Yedei Shahaya Nevuatan Divrei Kanterin Nitelet Nevuatan Be'atzman. There are three prophets because they offered words of castigation, of criticism. They are attributed as having said the words themselves. And Shlomo is mentioned, Amos and Yirmiyahu. So you see sort of that connection also in the Medrash between Amos and Yirmiyahu, that they are reluctant prophets because they don't really want to share this gloom and doom prophecy with others, but they really have no choice. I also, so let's continue on. He says, this compulsion to pass on knowledge is what causes people to write books, according to the Rambam. After all, if people were not compelled to share their knowledge with others, why then write a book? Were it not for this additional perfection, just to quote the Pines edition, sciences would not be set forth in books, and prophets would not call upon the people to obtain knowledge of the truth. For a man endowed with knowledge does not set anything down for himself in order to teach himself what he already knows. And so when anyone writes a book, he's writing it because he feels compelled to share this knowledge with others. Now, of course, the Rambam did not take into account other motivations for people to want to write books, either for the desire for fame or the desire to make money off of the publicly sharing of one's knowledge and selling books. The Rambam says it's such a burden to write books, and presumably in his time, he probably didn't make a lot of money off of writing books, especially not before the advent of the printing press. So why would a person go to all of that effort to hire a scribe or to scribe the works himself if it weren't for the fact that he feels compelled to share his knowledge with others. And we can almost imagine that the Rambam is speaking autobiographically about his own reflection in his own life. Why should I bother? I've got such a busy life. I'm a physician and I have so many things that I'd like to study. What compels me to write the things down, all of my classic works? Not, he didn't know that they would be classics, but what compels me to share this with my fellow countrymen? And it must be because when you're endowed with a certain level of knowledge, you have no choice but to share it with others. And then again, to quote the Rambam, we even find that prophets addressed a call to people until they were killed, this divine overflow moving them and by no means letting them rest and be quiet, even if they met with great misfortunes. In other words, there are sometimes people who know the truth and they feel so compelled to share this truth with others, even though they realize that they're going to get in terrible trouble as a result of sharing this information with other people. And again, we can only conjecture that perhaps the Rambam was sort of reflecting on himself, knowing that sharing knowledge that's contained in the Moreh Nevuchim and other kinds of writings that the Rambam contributed to the Jewish corpus of literature, knowing that he would be criticized for it, knowing that he would be called a heretic, which is actually certainly what happened both at the end of his life and certainly after his lifetime. There were, the famous episode of the burning of the writings of the Rambam because people accused him of heresy. He certainly was acknowledging in this chapter, what do I need it for? I certainly don't need the notoriety of being accused of being a heretic. But sometimes you have so much knowledge, even when you know it's going to harm you, it's going to harm your name, it could even end up getting you killed, you still feel compelled, you have no choice. You lose your free will and you need to share it with other people. And the Rambam, of course, is referring to the fact that we know of many great prophets in Jewish history who were assassinated specifically because they shared their prophetic knowledge with others, but they had no choice. There is a Midrash Agadah on Parshat Matot, which it's a funny place to find it, but the Medrash is commenting on a section in the Torah which talks about a woman taking vows, and her husband is capable of annulling her vows. And the Medrash views a woman taking vows as a form of rebelliousness against her husband, because when a woman swears she's never going to, let's say, serve her husband supper ever again, that's a form of rebellion. And so picking up on that topic, he says the Jewish people, this whole section is a metaphor for the Jewish people rebelling against God and rejecting his Torah, throwing off the yoke of heaven off of themselves. Ve'azu et HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ve'avdu ha'be'alim ve'ha'ashtarot. The Jewish people in different iterations in history have forsaken God, have worshipped idols. Lefichach nemar va'asara isar beveit aviha. And that's why it says that if a woman goes ahead and makes a vow in her father's house that does some in a prohibited way, in a way that is unbecoming of her, referring to the Jewish people. The Israel nimshulu lenashim, and the Jewish people are compared to this kind of woman. Ulefichach ramaz ve'asra asar beveit aviha ve'hakadosh baruch hu hochicham al yedei Yirmiyah. And then the Medrash continues by saying that God rebuked the Jewish people when they strayed away from God and worshipped other gods. And God sent the prophet Jeremiah, Asher ragamu oto b'nei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim v'kavru oto b'Mitzrayim. And then it says that Yirmiyah, what fate did he meet because he brought doom and gloom prophecies to the Jewish people? The Jews stoned him to death. He was assassinated by his own people in Egypt and was buried by the Egyptians because they viewed him as some kind of almost a deity figure, and they wanted to bless the Nile by placing him in the Nile. V'lo zeh hanavi bilvad haragu. The Jews didn't just kill the prophet Jeremiah. Ela acherim harbe hargu. Many other prophets were killed by the Jews. Chur uvasha harag l'Shmaya hanavi. There was a prophet Shemaiah hanavi who lives in the times of Rechavam, the son of King Solomon, who was assassinated by two men. Va'aviyah harag la'achiyah Shiloni. The prophet Achiyah Shiloni, who told Rechavam that he would become the next king of Judea, of Yisrael, Achia Shiloni came to Yeravam, the king, and told him he would be the king of Israel. That prophet Achia Shiloni, he was assassinated. The Yoash harag Zechariah ben Yehoyada b'chatzar Beit Hashem. The prophet Zechariah ben Yehoyada was assassinated in the courtyard of the temple itself. And as a result, the Shekhinah left the temple because until the times of the prophet Isaiah, the Yeshaya Hanavi Harago to Menashe ben Yechizkiyahu, and Isaiah himself was assassinated by King Menashe. And there's a whole very, very interesting story, very graphic story about how King Isaiah was able to magically insert himself into a tree, but King Menashe sawed the tree and killed him that way. But the bottom line is that we have a long line of prophets who were assassinated by their own people. And the Rambam basically explains to us that when you have the truth, when you have the knowledge of what is divine, you have no choice, even though you know that this is going to spell disaster for you, but you sometimes have to share it nonetheless. I also want to point out that we look at secular philosophy and we find this very same theme. When you look at Plato wrote a work called Socrates' Apology, and it goes through how Socrates was accused of sedition against the state, against Athens. And in writing his defense, he writes, I'll just read it for you, but you do have it, and you can always download the handouts that we give out, both on the Facebook community Shiur in Moreh Nevuchim and in the webyeshiva.org website. He says, "Men of Athens, I honor and love you, but I shall obey God rather than you, and while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone whom I meet after my manner and convincing him, saying, O my friend, why do you, who are a citizen of the great and mighty and wise city of Athens, care so much about laying up the greatest amount of money and honor and reputation, and so little about wisdom and truth, and the greatest improvement of the soul, which you never regard or heed at all? Are you not ashamed of this? And if this person with whom I am arguing says, yes, but I do care, I do not depart or let him go at once. I interrogate and examine and cross-examine him. And if I think that he has no virtue, but only says that he has, I reproach him with undervaluing the greater and overvaluing the less. And this I should say to everyone whom I meet, young and old, citizen and alien, but especially to the citizens, inasmuch as they are my brethren. For this is the command of God, as I would have you know. And I believe that to this day no greater good has ever happened in the state than my service to the God. For I do nothing but go about persuading you all, old and young alike, not to take thought for your persons and your properties, but first and chiefly to care about the great improvement of the soul. I tell you that virtue is not given by money, but that from virtue come money, and every other good of man, public as well as private. This is my teaching, and if this is the doctrine which corrupts the youth, my influence is ruinous indeed. But if anyone says that this is not my teaching, he is speaking in untruth. Wherefore, O men of Athens, I say to you, do as Anytus bids, or not as Anytus bids, and either acquit me or not. But whatever you do, know that I shall never alter my ways, not even if I have to die many times." And later on, after they convict him and find him guilty of sedition against Athens for not accepting their gods and for preaching philosophy, he's asked to pronounce his sentence. And later on in this dialogue, or later on in this work by Plato, he says, "Someone will say, 'Yes, Socrates, but cannot you hold your tongue? And then you may go into a foreign city, and no one will interfere with you.' Now I have great difficulty in making you understand my answer to this. For if I tell you that this would be a disobedience to a divine command, and therefore that I cannot hold my tongue, you will not believe that I am serious. And if I say again that the greatest good of man is daily to converse about virtue, and all that concerning which you hear me examining myself and others, and that the life which is unexamined is not worth living, that you are still less likely to believe. And yet what I say is true, although a thing of which it is hard for me to persuade you. I have no choice but to live the examined life and to share this examined life with others. I cannot hold my tongue," is what Socrates is quoted as saying by Plato. And of course, we know that the Rambam was a student of both Plato and Aristotle and is aware of this idea of the overflow of knowledge. I think I've said enough for today, but I just was felt very moved by this chapter in the sense that not only is the Rambam sort of describing what knowledge endows a person with, the gifts of knowledge, either to become a wise man or a prophet, but it also compels them with a great sense of not only responsibility, but even taking away their free will to decide whether to not or not to share this knowledge. One has no choice but to share that knowledge. And we can certainly appreciate how the Rambam himself must have felt about this in his own personal life. So let me hold it here. Let me wish you all a wonderful rest of the week. We will not be meeting next week. I'll be traveling, but Be'ezrat Hashem, I really do hope that in 2 weeks from today, we'll be able to resume with chapter 38, continuing the discussion of prophecy. Take care now, everyone. Bye-bye.